Judicial review gives the Supreme Court authority to invalidate laws that are unconstitutional. But that authority is not guaranteed. And as history has shown, it's up to the executive and legislative branches to respect the rulings of the court.
Doctorow, doctorow. 1795, a time when Cherokee culture is thriving. But it is also a time of intense change. The Cherokee people had once dominated what is now the south-central United States. But by the end of the 1700s, they had lost 2/3 of their land in conflicts with the British and American governments. The land is now being overrun by white Americans, bringing profound change. New ideas, new ways of doing things, new technology. The Cherokees try to live in harmony with their new neighbors. But the settlers' demand for more land is too great. Chief Dragon Canoe makes a disturbing prophecy.
Finally, the whole country which the Cherokees and their fathers have so long occupied will be demanded, and the remnant of the Aniawea, the principal people, once so great and formidable, will be compelled to seek refuge in some distant wilderness.
Removal. That is the government's answer to conflict between the white Americans and the Native Americans. Simply move the Cherokees and all eastern tribes west of the Mississippi River. In 1802, President Jefferson takes an irrevocable step towards removal. He signs the Compact of 1802. Georgia's western lands, the future Alabama and Mississippi, are given to the U.S. government. In exchange, the government would begin the removal of Native Americans from this land. The Cherokees know they cannot stop land cessations with tribal laws alone. They must establish their national sovereignty so that they can deal with the white Americans nation to nation. The Cherokees decide to transform their own government, and they use the U.S. system as a model. They create a bicameral legislature and set up a treasury. They adopt a written constitution and elect their first principal chief, John Ross.
He devoted his life to two principles. One was, first, the preservation of the Cherokee people in their homeland, to which he said they had a God-given right. The other was the unity of the Cherokee people.
Unwilling to tolerate an independent Cherokee nation within its borders, Georgia refuses to recognize the government headed by John Ross. It outlaws the Cherokee Constitution and proclaims its right to seize Cherokee lands at will. 1828. Georgia enacts laws that strip the Cherokees of their civil rights.
No Cherokee could mine gold on his own land. No Cherokee could testify in court against a white man. No Cherokee could carry weapons. The Cherokees were forbidden to meet in council.
Soon, the Cherokees' worst fears are realized. In the 1828 presidential election, Georgia strongly supports a man who has promised, if elected, to remove the Cherokee tribes completely from white society. He is Andrew Jackson.
I always believe that there are little things that tell us a lot. And if you look at Jackson's correspondence with Indians, they frequently began and talk about, "My children, let me take you by the hand." With regard to Indian removal, he says, "Let me take you by the hand to a new land in the West."
In the spring of 1830, Andrew Jackson sends the Indian Removal Act to Congress.
That it shall be lawful for the President of the United States to
The
cause territory
Indian
west
Removal
of
Act was one of the great controversial pieces of legislation of the first half of the 19th century. The Cherokees mounted a major campaign to prevent its passage.
But Jackson's forces in favor of removal are too strong for the Cherokees and their allies in the House and Senate. On May 26, 1830, the U.S. Congress narrowly passes the Indian Removal Act. John Ross decides to seek justice in the only place he can, the United States Supreme Court. The Cherokees twice challenge the Georgia laws in the Supreme Court. The second case appears decisive. In March 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall announces the court's verdict.
The Cherokee Nation is a distinct community, occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia have no force. The Act of the State of Georgia is consequently void.
It is a great triumph on the part of the Cherokees. The laws of the state are declared by the highest judicial tribunal in the country to be null and void. The question is forever settled as to who is right and who is wrong.
Victory is short-lived, however. President Jackson chooses to ignore Chief Justice Marshall's ruling.
But of course, everyone knows Jackson's words. You know, at that time, he said, John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. And Georgia took that as a license to burn, a license to kill.
Until that time, the Cherokees had remained remarkably united. But once the Supreme Court decision was ignored, the Cherokees, many of them, believed that they had no hope.
Winter, 1835. Principal Chief John Ross goes to Washington, D.C., determined to fight off removal. Another Cherokee, Major John Ridge, travels there as well, though he has no official authority. Ross and Ridge compete with each other over who will represent the Cherokees to the U.S. government. When Jackson realizes Ross is just stalling, he strikes a deal with Ridge. $5 million and land in Oklahoma in exchange for all the Cherokee land east of the Mississippi River. The treaty is signed by only a handful of Cherokees, a tiny minority in a nation of thousands.
Jackson was so anxious to get a treaty of any kind that he was willing to take that before the Senate.
A few months later, Jackson manages to push the treaty through Congress, getting it ratified by a single vote. Many Americans are outraged. May 23, 1836. Jackson signs the Treaty of New Echota, which gives the Cherokees exactly 2 years to pack up and leave their ancestral lands. May 23, 1838. The deadline for voluntary removal of the Cherokees has arrived. about 2,000 Cherokees living in the southeast have left voluntarily. Those remaining, some 15,000, have continued tilling their fields and relying on John Ross to save their homes. But there is no last-minute reprieve.
Cherokees, the President of the United States has sent me with a powerful army to cause you to join that part of your people already on the other side of the Mississippi.
General Winfield Scott, respected veteran of the War of 1812, has come into Cherokee country commanding a 7,000-man army charged with rounding up the Cherokees. Only a few hundred who've become U.S. citizens and own their land individually will be allowed to remain. U.S. soldiers start herding the Cherokees into stockades, the first step in sending them west.
These were people who had for centuries, for thousands of years, been rooted to place, and in that place their idea and definition of themselves. For them, moving was a form of death. In Cherokee mythology, west stands for blackness and for death.
During the long journey west, which became known as the Trail of Tears, thousands of Cherokees suffer from cold, fatigue, and hunger. Many contract pneumonia and tuberculosis.
That there was so little food for the people that the dogs were starving. And so when the people without shoes began leaving bloody footprints in the snow, the dogs would fight over licking the blood from the footprints.
It was just too rough a situation for the children. If they were anything less than about 10 years old, most of them died. And for the older people, it was just too rough again, and they died off like flies, and they buried them along the way. So we got here with the strongest element of our nation, but that was all that was left.
Finally, on January 4th, 1839, the first Cherokee wagon train reaches the tribe's new lands in what will eventually become Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears had ended.
Now it's your turn to answer a question. How is President Andrew Jackson able to overrule the decision of the Supreme Court?